Welcome to yet another edition of Deep Dive featuring Hudson Institute, during the course of which we're going to focus yet again on various intricacies throughout the Middle East, here in Israel and beyond. To do so, let's now turn to the director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at Hudson, namely Senior Fellow Dr. Michael Duluran. It's great to see you, sir. I'd like to take immediately this opportunity to ask you particularly on what would you identify at this moment in time as the most challenging aspect faced throughout this region?
Jonathan, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I think the Rafah question is the one that is on everyone's mind today, especially because of all the people who died yesterday in the Israeli attack. This is going to intensify the pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to shut down the war. Hamas, of course, we know Yahya Sinwar is demanding a complete end to the war and the evacuation of all the Israeli troops from Gaza. He has, unfortunately, I think, an American policy that is moving in his direction. Of course, the Israelis don't, the Americans don't, the Biden administration does not want to say that that's what it's doing, but it's pretty obvious if you look at all the different positions the Biden administration is taking on all of the issues related to the war, that Biden really wants to shut this down. He really wishes that Yahya Sinwar would come toward him a little bit and accept an extended ceasefire, which he then would hopefully turn into a permanent ceasefire. But Sinwar is demanding ceasefire up front. It's hard to understand. It's hard to predict how this is going to play out, because after the Rafah conquest is over, I assume that the Israelis are going to push through to the complete conquest of Rafah. But we can see with this. With the shooting of rockets that's still going on, this is very difficult to suppress. The Israeli public is going to want guarantees that the rocket fire from Gaza is suppressed, and yet it's going to be very hard for the IDF to be able to say that and to say that the war is over.
Indeed. Let's now turn to elsewhere here in Jerusalem, where we're joined by Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, formerly a director of the military prosecution for Judea and Samaria, right now, of course, at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, where he acts as the director of the Initiative for Accountability and Reform of the Palestinian Authority. It's good to see you, Colonel. I'd like to ask you, and initially actually cite a remark made by Major General Yifat Tomer Yerushalmi, the current IDF Advocate General of the IDF, where she says that, specifically in reference to what Dr. Duran mentioned about the incident in Rafah, naturally in a war of such scope and intensity, difficult events also happen. Some incidents, like last night's incident in Rafah, are very grave. The details of yesterday's incident are still under an investigation, which we are committed to conducting to the fullest extent. The IDF regrets any harm to non-combatants during war. What can you tell us about the process in which the IDF operates at a time when information wars are taking also place throughout the world in trying to depict the IDF as a genocide army, so to speak? And naturally, that's not the case. It's a Western military operating within the scope of international law. Nonetheless, it is quite challenging to relay that. So where do you see all of that?
You're absolutely correct. The situation in Rafah is, and in the Gaza Strip in general, is very complex. It's intense urban warfare. It's a genocidal, homicidal terrorist group that are hiding within the civilian population. That's really what makes it so difficult to operate. They've located all of their assets inside the population, underneath the population, abusing every type of symbol that could have sought or been of refuge to anyone: schools, mosques, hospitals. And so you have that complexity. The IDF is nonetheless trying to operate within that framework, adhering to the laws of war. But even in war, you have occasions where you can attack a military target and civilians may be killed. It's not the target of the attack, and it's definitely not the desired result. And we can see that the IDF really has taken extreme measures to protect the civilian population. But that's part of the process. And when you have incidents like that, there is an entire mechanism which then checks and double checks and investigates exactly what happened. What was the target? Was there a legitimate target? What was the expected damage that could have been caused? What was the intelligence at the time? The equation for international law isn't, well, looking back in hindsight, look what happened, but rather what the reasonable military commander knew at the time of the strike.
Thank you, Colonel. I, of course, will revert to you back to discuss more on the ICJ's ruling with regards to the ongoing military operation in Rafah. But initially, I'd like to turn to Colonel in Reserve Miri Eisen, formerly a senior officer at the IDF Intelligence Directorate, among other senior intelligence positions, currently the director of the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University. It's good to see you, Colonel. You're one of the top experts on disinformation and information wars here in Israel. What can you tell us about this front right now where Israel is seemingly on the losing end, unfortunately, saying so? How can Israel maneuver at a time when, on the one hand, we had the injuncture by the ICJ to stop the war in specifically the Rafah area, not throughout the Gaza Strip, but nonetheless, the IDF has to contend with barrages of rockets, as Dr. Duran mentioned, launched from Rafah towards central Israel, targeting civilian communities.
On the one hand, we have the rockets that yesterday here on campus, I was in a classroom and you had a rocket attack. And in its own way, we kind of took it in stride. But you asked about information warfare. So I'm actually going to differ, Dr. Duran, from what you said before. To me, the biggest challenge right now is not the international community when it comes to Rafah. It's the international community, and they're being impacted in this information warfare. That enormous gap that has become literally just a gulf between the narrative, the description, the terror attack, the words that both Maurice and before that you yourself and Jonathan have used of that genocidal, homicidal Hamas terror organization, not just of what they did on October 7th, but what they pre-planned in the sense of sending out in the information warfare their position as the victim. They're the ones who are under attack. Where are we 7.5 months later? That we are the ones that have to explain ourselves of why we're attacking in Rafah, why uninvolved civilians are the ones who are unprotected because of Hamas. That is most definitely the biggest success, not just of Hamas in this war. I would broaden that and say, I think it is a success of Hezbollah, that nobody's talking about what they're doing on our northern border and what that does inside Israel. It is the enormous success of Iran that directly attacked Israel in this war, that indirectly funds and trains everything going on, again, that information warfare. And I'd say that in that sense, what has happened is that the use of terminology, which is terminology of people who have all sorts of ideas and ethos, is being used in a cruel and cynical way, where people who believe in freedom and in good erroneously, I want to be nice about this, erroneously do not understand the misinformation, disinformation, and horrific lies they are being fed, to the degree that it doesn't just impact on a college campus and the college professors. It is impacting the ICC, the ICJ, the street, the airplanes that are willing to come to Israel. For me, that is the biggest success until now of Hamas and all the different arena. And I greatly worry about how it can yet develop, meaning it's not about, my heart can go out to uninvolved civilians killed in a war. The war is about a horrific terror hybrid organization embedded in a population and using their status as the victim to make Israel be the only country sidelined by the world, vilified by the world, vilified in every plateau possible.
I think it's a couple of points. The first one, it's quite interesting to note that just a couple of weeks ago, we had EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell coming out and admitting that his key source of information coming out of the Gaza Strip is Al Jazeera, which is obviously a source of disinformation with regard to everything that is occurring in the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip, and also shows how the European Union's foreign policy and security chief brings about his decision-making and his rhetoric also against Israel, which speaks volumes for itself. The second thing I think it's important always to remind to our viewers, over 230 days ago, the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200, mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 people, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 125 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date, including in Rafah, which is very important to remember, and it seems like most people forget. They keep on citing all kind of figures that have nothing to do with reality. But let's now turn to our next guest, also from across the pond right now, Brigadier General in Reserve, Yaron Rosen, formerly an Israeli Air Force commander, a fighter pilot, and the chief of the IDF cyber staff. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you on the complexities of operation currently in the Gaza Strip in general, but also in the Rafah area in particular, considering also the various concerns cited by various international actors and officials who are not privy to the complexities of waging war.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan. I think it's obvious that the operations in Rafah are very complex. Having said that, for various reasons that were mentioned, I think Israel will need to continue push this operation in Rafah to keep pushing out Hamas and going all the way in to the last post, last resort of where Hamas fighters, Hamas brigades are. There's just no other way to defeat Hamas as it is. Not to say that Hamas should be defeated with all its militants killed, but the rule of Hamas through or in the whole Gaza Strip is the only way to eliminate this rule is to go everywhere Hamas rules. So on one hand, it is very complex, but the IDF has learned through the last 8 months almost to fight in this very, very complex urban warfare. On the other hand, we still have, it is very complex from the other side of the border with the Egyptians that we're not talking about, in the sense that the Egyptians are not mentioned as responsible for anything. They're just, they're standing on sort of the sideline of the Philadelphia line. But actually, if we look into it, speaking about informational warfare, how are they responsible for what's going on in Gaza? What about the tunnels that go from Egypt and make a lot of money for some quite a few Egyptians on the other side? So where are they responsible for this monster that Israel has let grow on its border? So I think that it's time, speaking about, again, the informational warfare, I think it's time for us to change the narrative. This is war of narratives. Iran, I agree with some of the comments made previously. I think Iran's narrative is winning. And in that sense, that is very bad, not for Israel. That is very bad for the region, for the stability of the region. I think we need to cling back to the story of the Abrahamic Accords. A. B. Iran, that wants to be a hegemony in its aspirations, regional hegemon. It wants to be nuclear. This will not be pushed back if Iran gains all this power in the region, and they're very successful. How about the Straits of Bab el-Mandab? How is the West agreeing to that? How is Egypt agreeing to that? Where are we talking about all those issues? If we want to counter that, we need to change the narrative. We're caught in this paradigm of going back to a two-state solution. Sorry for the language, what the hell does that have to do with what's going on right now? I mean, we have to change the language now. This is the last thing the region needs right now. Two-state solution will not solve anything, as well as bringing any one of the suggestions that was brought up to Gaza. Gaza, for a long time from now on, for the next months or years, will need to be ruled by someone from the outside, namely the Israelis and the United States, because we are the only ones that can ensure that Hamas doesn't grow into a monster again. And there are more ideas I think we need to discuss on the alternative narrative for the future and stability of the region, namely expanding the Abrahamic Accords with Saudis and more. But let's leave it for the next session.
As you know, Generals, and I appreciate you, and I can't agree more. A two-state solution, in my opinion, right now is a two-state delusion. But when we're talking specifically about the Palestinian Authority, for instance, if you insert them in northern Samaria, let's not even talk about the Gaza Strip, they will be killed. Okay, they will be eliminated. The same goes for the Gaza Strip. They will not survive there because the clans opposing them and supporting Hamas right now are far more superior and more capable than the Palestinian Authority, irrespective of Western aspirations. And therefore, when we're looking at the Islamist Hamas, in order to eradicate it, and I do agree that it is possible. It doesn't mean to kill all of them, because those numbers would demand a genocide. Let's put that plainly. Nevertheless, it is possible to weaken them to the point where the alternative clans within the Gaza Strip will be bolstered and will have the confidence to confront the Islamist Hamas, and with international backing and regional assurances and guarantees, something like this could conform. Nevertheless, we are far from such a reality at this point in time. Therefore, Dr. Duran, I'd like to talk more of a broader sense. Colonel Eisen spoke about the Iranian proxy Hezbollah on Israel's northern front, significant clashes with an upward trajectory of hostilities recorded over the weekend once again. What should Israel do in order to bring about a change of reality, since this Iranian proxy is seemingly outmaneuvering Western efforts on the diplomatic front to bring about some sort of resolution?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I think Colonel Eisen described it very well, what the overall challenge is. From my point of view, sitting in Washington, the issue really comes down to American policy. This is the big dilemma that the Israelis have. And so the simple answer to your question is, what do the Israelis need to do? They need to change American policy. But of course, that is not an easy thing to do at all. But the Biden administration has framed this conflict from day one as a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that is objectively false, because Hezbollah is part of it. The Houthis are part of it. It is an Iranian conflict with not just with Israel, but really with the American alliance system. And if the administration had framed it that way, or was interested in framing it that way, then it would mean that Israel was on the front lines fighting for the United States, fighting for the West, against the Iranian alliance system, the resistance axis, which wants to undermine the American system in the region. It isn't doing that, and it's impossible to underestimate the impact of that decision. For example, I'll just give you one, and then we can move on. But the Egyptians now, they're suffering from the fact that commercial traffic through the Suez Canal has been reduced enormously because of the Houthi actions in the Red Sea. The Egyptians don't have the ability to send forces to go open up the Red Sea. Only the United States can organize that, and the United States is not doing it. It has an operation to punish the Houthis somewhat, but not enough to deter them, and not enough to restore the commercial traffic through the Suez Canal. So what is the American answer? The American answer is shut the war down now, and that will restore the traffic. So if you're sitting in Egypt, what are your choices? Your choices are either help the Americans put pressure on the Israelis to shut down the war, or sit and suffer. So the Egyptians aren't doing what all the things that the Egyptians are doing to obstruct the Israelis or to make life more difficult for the Israelis isn't simply a calculation that they're making in Cairo. It's a reaction to an American strategy, which has defined Israel now as the problem and not Iran. There's no debate going on in the White House about whether to get tougher with Iran. The debate is only how tough to be with Israel, which is completely distorted in my view.
This is very interesting, Dr. Duran. I'd like to ask you, Colonel Eisen, since this is something that we've spoke about for years now, and particularly recent reports about the fact that the E3, as part of the P5+1, that brought about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and UN Security Council Resolution 2231 in 2015, it now emerges that the E3, France, Britain, and Germany are preparing some sort of vote to reprimand or to conduct a reprimand of the Islamic Republic of Iran at the IAEA Board of Governors, something that, to my surprise, or maybe not, the Biden administration is trying to thwart, and by applying pressure on Paris, Berlin, and London. What's going on there, and how can partners and allies of the United States in the Middle East, including Israel, but also others who are deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear proliferation, have a sense of reassurance or confidence in an administration in Washington that seems to only appease the Islamic Republic and to diminish any type of friction that could bring about a more positive reaction?
Jonathan, you make any answer that I'm going to give be a really challenging one. I'm not the one who's going to sit here right now inside Israel and call out the U.S. administration. I think that we are in a very difficult war, and for months, and I'm going to agree with everybody that that has changed, but for months there was very overt, open U.S. administration support for our military action, and I would even say continues to be for certain aspects of that military action taking place within the Gaza Strip. But you took me over to Iran. And here I'm going to both agree with Dr. Hudson, but I'm going to push it back at all of us. The state of Israel, the government of Israel, from October 7th, they're not looking at Iran. We may all agree here right now, as we're talking here right now, that Iran is the issue, that Iran is both the proxies and the training, the ideology, and I'm going to go so far as to say the inspiration, because you need a lot of inspiration. But Iran is also a state player. Iran is a state actor. Iran is a country with 90 million people. Who wants to actually attack Iran? What I keep hearing from people that I meet from the United States, including probably in the administration, is, well, you have to deal with Iran as if it's Israel against Iran and not Iran, the Islamic regime of Iran, against the entire world. Really? So if the Islamic regime is the problem, don't you think that threatens absolutely everybody in the world? So in this sense, when I look at the overall aspects, let's put it on the table. It's an election year. Things are going to happen in the United States because of the election year, that there are things that are agreed upon that I totally disagree with. But I live here in Israel. And I say that because I'm aware of domestic politics and where it meets international politics. But for God's sake, really, it hurts my stomach right now to think of how everybody in the world, and I say sadly, even Israel including, because of this war, are ignoring the Islamic regime of Iran and what it's doing under this war, with this war, in the information war, and making it so much worse that no matter where we go, for us again, I just feel that they're the only ones that are winning almost literally on every front.
We're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like still to hear both of our distinguished guests. But initially, General Rosen, I'd like to hear first, how could we leverage the current situation in the Gaza Strip strategically vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Changing the narrative that Iran is succeeding right now is very important, because they are now pushing on all fronts, both military through the proxies, informational and diplomatic, as described, very successfully, quite successfully. I think Gaza, if we change the story to Gaza first, actually the story needs to be that we are saving Gazans from Hamas and Iran. The Palestinians' biggest enemy are the Iranians that are using the Palestinians again and again to fight their wars, as they are doing in the entire region. If we change that story and we start actually with Gaza first, attracting international in the long term, an international investment in rebuilding Gaza in a way that I cannot describe right now because we are in the middle of a war. But I think that because of the intensity of this war, there is an actual opportunity for a reset of Gaza that has not been before. This is now the chance to build a new idea for Gaza. How
And
will
also,
that come to play? Exactly who will be responsible? We will need time. A. B. We need to discuss and to counter the Iranian strategy by talking about Israel's final borders. Just imagine if tomorrow morning the United States wakes up and tells the world that it recognizes Israel's final borders as the border with Jordan in the east, the valley, the Jordan Valley. It has recognized already the Golan Heights. For the Iranians, that is a diplomatic blow. If we do that, it helps internal politics in Israel to say that the war was worth going for the war because now we got our borders. So we need to jump out of the conundrum and of this really complex situation that we are in and bring in new ideas to reshape the narrative and to bring back the expansion of the Abrahamic Accords to build stability, rebuild Gaza, and rebuild the story that pushes Iran back to the east.
thank you, General Hussein. Colonel Hirsch, I'd like, in a minute and a half, I'm going to challenge you here. The ruling by the ICJ about ordering basically Israel to stop its fight in Rafah, how does that impact Israel's capabilities in basically employing its operational activities within that scope, within that sector? And does this mean now that Israel needs to find alternative means for the period ahead?
So I think that first we have to understand the nature of the beast that we're dealing with. It's called the International Court of Justice, but it's not a court and there's no justice. You have the president of the court who is Lebanese, a country who is at war with Israel, who is previously in his position as ambassador for Lebanon to the UN, called Israel an apartheid country. He's now sitting at the head of this international forum that's now judging Israel on this trumped-up Iranian charge of committing a genocide. At the same time, this same court is hearing and giving an advisory opinion on the ramifications of Israel's prolonged occupation, so-called, of Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. This, in any circumstance, would be reason, cause to recuse all of the judges, and yet none of them had the common decency, let alone the legal requirement, to recuse themselves. And therefore, that has to be the context in which we look at the judgment, which in and of itself was innate. It really doesn't say anything. It doesn't give anything. It doesn't require Israel to stop fighting in Rafah. It just requires Israel to adhere to its already existing policy of not carrying out a genocide. We're there to destroy terrorists and nothing else, and that's fine.
Colonel Hirsch, General Hussein, Colonel Eisen, and Dr. Duran, thank you so very much for your insights today. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well until our next edition of Deep Dive featuring Hudson from here in Jerusalem. Have a good evening.